organization. We've also been promoting this as an opportunity and an educational initiative to the entire organization, because certainly within this current moment, recognizing that this is an important conversation for us to be having, and there is a lot of value in really digging into these conversations around, certainly in this particular instance, racial justice. And I think as we continue to look into other aspects of justice through other programs within the series, we'll be able to expand upon that conversation and provide some additional avenues for folks to reflect and think and hopefully find opportunities to take action within their lives, as well as within the purview that they have to take action within the fraternity. Right now, for individuals who have not heard of the Advancement of Justice Task Force or maybe have not expressed interest in that, if as part of the conversations tonight you do find that you are interested in being a part of that, certainly you can let us know. All you have to do, certainly you can contact me at borton@deltu.org, or just contact the national office, and we can get you connected with the individuals who will be heading that up. We currently have Craig Franz and Bernard Franklin, who are the co-chairs for that task force, and they will be talking about next steps and whatnot. So for individuals who are a part of the task force, know that while we're using this as an opportunity to start having some conversations, that really the actual formal work of the task force and the plans for that task force will actually be coming together in the very near future, and you will be receiving more messages about that soon. So, so this is just kind of an opportunity to start opening up some conversation and start laying some of the groundwork to lead into some of the work that task force is going to be doing, and hopefully setting up some great things in the future for Delta Upsilon. So if anybody has any questions about that, certainly we'll be available later and dig into more of that later. Now, for tonight's session, again, really appreciate everyone being here, appreciate the time, the investment, the care, and also want to impress upon everyone the importance that we approach this important conversation with fraternal regard and with respect, and expect that we will all treat each other well as we have this conversation and engage in civil discourse, and be willing to treat each other well as we and treat each other with good intention as we engage in this conversation, and know that we have a good steward here with us to help provide us with some education and help facilitate some good reflection, as well as some good discourse for us tonight. And so we had the opportunity to have this session because actually Veronica, my coworker here in educational programs, has a personal relationship through her alma mater at Carthage College. So she was able to really facilitate this program for us. And so I know she's got a good history with Roger. And so I'll go ahead and stop framing things up now, and we'll get to the good stuff here. And I'll turn it over to Veronica to introduce our presenter tonight.
Thank you so much, Noah. For those of you who I do not know that are viewing in, my name is Veronica Moore, and I serve the fraternity proudly as the Director of Educational Programs. We are so excited to host this session tonight with Roger Moreano, a dear friend of mine and higher educational colleague. Had an opportunity to facilitate some conversations around racial injustice and just get a pulse of how people were feeling after the civil unrest that we all witnessed about a month ago. And from that session, all of the participants were like, we need a part two. And so Roger decided to host this same session for a couple of Carthage friends and anyone else that wanted to join. And as we were talking about some educational content for the fraternity, I felt that this was a wonderful way for us to be able to set the foundation. And so I asked Roger to bless us with his presence and provide us with our first educational opportunity for this topic and for the task force. So I'm happy to introduce to you all Roger Moreano, who is the Associate Dean of Students at Carthage College and the Director of Diversity and Equity. He is also the founder of Bridges for Justice, a social justice nonprofit organization that is operated out of Lake County, Illinois. Want to provide you all with just a few more updates that if you have questions as we are going through the presentation, you have an opportunity to post those questions in the Q&A box and we will be monitoring those. So Roger, I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
All right. Thank you, Veronica and Noah and to Delta Upsilon for inviting me to be a part of this this evening. And so I'm going to go ahead and set up our screen here in our presentation to get us started. And so so tonight's topic is something that I think is a good foundational starting point in addressing the issues of justice that exist in our country and globally. And I think what's been evident to me and for many of my colleagues who do this work, and Veronica and I have had many conversations in the last couple of months about this, we have a real divide clearly happening in this country, and so much of it is rooted in what I believe is an illiteracy around racial issues. I think there's a fundamental lack of a deep understanding and education of the actual history of our society, how it's played out, the structures that have been put into place, and how it's impacted groups from different backgrounds. And so often we address the issues of justice and equity that are currently happening in front of us from a lens of just what we see in front of us today, and quite often don't understand or are unaware of the context and background that led us to where we're at today. So today is really a history lesson. This presentation I've done on several occasions to get the conversation started, and hopefully in the weeks to come as you continue to do this work, this will provide a grounding of information and knowledge to guide you in your work, in the good work that your organization is doing, of which I'm proud to be a part of. And so this evening. And so with that said, you know, tonight I'm gonna just start off by saying that I think that as we move through the presentation, this presentation, and I want to put it out there right in front, is not about different opinions. And I want to explain what I mean by that. We live also in a society that opinions and facts are often treated as equal or as the same thing. And again, part of the lack of progress I believe we see moving forward on a number of issues like racial justice is rooted in a lack of understanding that in order to really move forward, we have to understand what is actually factual and that our opinions are rooted in factual information. And so this is not just an issue of different opinions. It's not a conversation about political ideology. So another thing that seems to come into play when it comes to the issues of race and racism is the liberal versus conservative, the Democrat versus Republican, the what have you, different sides that are that we are pigeonholed into. Racial justice does not have a political ideology. Racial justice does not fall into one political party's camp or another, a political ideology or the other. Everyone, regardless of political ideology, should be invested in racial justice. What is required is factual information and information that we can all work toward to create a more equitable society. So, and as I state here in this first bullet point, we are at a place right now in our society where it's not enough to be not racist as an individual. We have to, as an organization, as individuals, really practice being anti-racist, meaning that we have to not just not do something that would be discriminatory or prejudiced. We have to actively advocate for it to not happen to others around us and to be really invested in one another. This presentation is also not about blame or guilt. That sometimes actually may be felt by some folks that are listening in on a presentation or in an audience when I've done this in front of audiences. That is a very natural feeling to have, but I really feel that if you feel some sense of blame or guilt, while it's a natural process, it really is not helpful to stay there. It's quite frankly a good opportunity to use any blame or guilt that you feel to motivate yourself to really start moving toward action and really understanding how you can stand against injustice, I should say, in your communities. And as I stated at the beginning, this presentation is not necessarily going to be pleasant because it gets into some really hard history that we have to talk about. There are images on this presentation that will trigger folks from a racial lens, perhaps related to violence and other forms of discrimination and dehumanization, but it is absolutely necessary for us to really delve into this because it is quite often invisible in our educational experiences that we have in our society. So we have to kind of dig deep into this so that we can create a better world moving forward. And this is because we have to move beyond kind of the kumbaya holding hand moments. Quite often when I get into diversity and equity work in communities and some of the consulting that I do, there's a real almost insistence by folks to stay in that pleasant space of, you know, those kumbaya moments, which absolutely have value. There's an absolute time and place for us to have celebrations and moments where we seek out our commonalities and cherish and celebrate our commonalities. That is hugely important in the development of relationships across difference. But that can't be done authentically and sincerely unless we address also the things that have kept us not just apart, but also unequal in many ways. So I'm going to ask us to push in that direction this evening, because as James Baldwin once said, that we can agree, or we can disagree, excuse me, and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist. And this is where the whole it's my opinion versus your opinion has to be really addressed, because sometimes you might have an opinion, or I might have an opinion that is not rooted in facts, is rooted in stereotypes, or is rooted in misinformation. And in the process of advocating for those opinions, we might be dehumanizing or marginalizing further communities that are already marginalized. So I want to ask us to think about that as we move through this process this evening. And what's great about your organization and what so many groups are doing now, especially in the last couple of months, we've seen a real skyrocketing of efforts in companies and in organizations to really educate folks on these issues. And as Ruth Manorama said at one point, an intensive human rights education for all communities needs to be provided to overcome the old prejudices that so many of the divides we have. I'm very convinced, having done this work for a long time, is rooted in people who are not really ill-intended. And many of the moments of discrimination or marginalization that occur quite often happen when we are unaware that we're doing it. We have a whole heck of a lot of very good people who might be unintentionally exasperating racial tension because we just don't know. So part of tonight is getting us to know a little bit more so that we are not unintentionally exasperating those differences. And so I'm going to have us keep that in mind as we move forward. So how did we get here, right? If we're trying to become a fraternal organization or a company that is anti-racist and actually advocating for a more equitable world, how do we address the world that we're in right now? How did we get here? Well, many people in the political arena point to the political world, right, and things that have happened, and may not consider, and what the premise of this presentation will be, is that perhaps the system was built this way. Quite often, as we saw during the George Floyd protests, Black Lives Matter protests, we heard people say, and I heard from students of mine who contacted me to say, why is there still racism happening? Why are we still protesting in the streets? Why are we still here? Why haven't we moved past this? We are in 2020, right? We should be well past this. Dr. King, the civil rights movement was over 50 years ago. In my response to that is that when questions like that are asked, it tells me that there is a misunderstanding of the system itself and how we got here. That racism didn't just show up one day and then it goes away after marches and some laws are passed. Perhaps the reason it's not going away is because it was already ingrained and a part of the foundational beginnings of the system and of the country and of the formation of the country. And that's what this presentation will get into. It's going to hopefully inform all of us into some of the structures we might not have been aware of that really designed the country and the movement forward economically, educationally, politically around the idea of white supremacy. And we're going to get into that in just a moment, because in recent years, some folks have said, well, this is when it started. You know, we had this contentious election 3-4 years ago now, and we heard the rhetoric that was happening, and people were saying, well, why are these things happening? Why are white supremacist groups more vocal now than they have been? And that is, again, a short-sighted view of our society. These things have actually existed for a long time. And when we heard the phrase in the last election, and we hear similar phrases during this election season of making America great again, I've asked this question of students of different communities. If we had a sign that said "Make America Great," how many of you think would agree with that. And I think in every room I was in doing these presentations, just about every hand went up from people of all backgrounds. But when you add the word again to it, that has a different connotation and meaning depending on the lens through which you see the world and the lens through which your culture, your ancestors, and the lived experiences of your community and your families, how that shaped your view of what the past was like. And so when we say again, we have to start understanding what salience means, what cultural and historical salience means if I happen to be of a different background. And so it has meant different things to different folks, depending on who you ask. And I know for me personally, I'm a Latinx man. I'm a Puerto Rican, Ecuadorian American who was born in Chicago, but I was born of two adults, a mom and a dad who came here when they were adults. And being an American and being who I am has meant different things to me. And I grew up in a family that was very diverse. And I've heard people as I've grown older and gotten to the place I am in my life, people from backgrounds that are different than my own, majority white folks, saying that part of the problems we have today is that we need to go back to what it was like in the 1950s. That's when, society was moving forward, educational systems were growing, the economy was booming, and we saw the real birth of the middle class that occurred during that time period. And I think there's like a very nostalgic and romantic Leave It to Beaver feeling of that era, that there was something very special about that era. And quite honestly, we did have quite a bit of economic growth for large segments of our society during that time. But again, when we talk about Make America Great Again, what does that mean to different folks, right? Because that era of the 1950s also saw the civil rights movement. It saw, people continuing to still be lynched in certain parts of the country, Black Americans being lynched, churches being bombed, civil rights marchers being attacked by police, right? So that was a very tumultuous era if you were not white and middle class. And so again, Making America Great means what? And it meant different things to different folks, because after the 2016 election, some of these images started to show up around the country. In fact, the Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a civil rights organization which fights hate groups around the country, they successfully bankrupted the Klan back in the 1980s. They received over 900 reports of these types of graffiti happening all around the country in the 10 days following the 2016 election. And we hadn't really seen anything like this for decades. And it was very, very impactful for people. And I know for me personally, that's when my work, especially with schools, really started picking up, because that image on the lower left-hand side that says whites only, that was at my children's high school. And that happened during that time. And I remember my oldest daughter, who was a sophomore at the time, calling me. I was getting ready to do a presentation much like this at my institution that I worked at. And I saw her text come in, and it was just about to start. And she said, "Dad, can I skip class?" And I'm thinking, okay, really? You want to skip class? Come on, give me a break. And then she immediately texted afterward to say, "There's a rally happening. There was racial graffiti. I really want to participate. Will you support me?" And then I immediately completely transformed my attitude and said, "Yes, just go. I'll talk to your teachers if we need to do that," but not knowing what had happened yet. And so it's a very tumultuous time, right? And we've reached a point where this kind of rhetoric and this kind of language is much more common and visible again, where it kind of was dormant for a few decades. And so I try to make the argument that when people say, why are we seeing these things in 2016 or today? Why are we seeing these protests? They've always been there. They've honestly always been there. And through the help of technology, through telephones, through video technology, we've been able to capture a lot of these moments now in more recent years. And it's important to know, and I'll talk a little bit later about the 1619 Project, which is a project through the New York Times and looking at American history through a racialized lens, really points out to some important historical moments that have been kept out of the history books that show and demonstrate very conclusively to most folks that race has been a central feature in the shaping of this country in many different ways. And so we had at the beginning of 1619, when the first enslaved Africans were brought over, you had about a 150-year period or so where you had indentured servitude, and it slowly transformed in many ways to chattel slavery, which is a very uniquely American invention. And I won't spend too much time on this era because we won't have time to get into it tonight, but I urge you to look at the history of the period between 1619 and 1776 or so, when indentured servitude, which was a practice that was throughout not just Europe, but other parts of the world as well, had workers working in difficult conditions and basically having to serve their employer or their landowner for periods of time until they earned their freedom. And so there was a period of time that they had to work under contract before they can actually earn their freedom. And at that point, they were freed. Well, what ended up happening is that in the late 1600s, these contracts, the landowners needed these workers to stay longer because they needed as much free labor as possible. And so they extended the dates of the contract and the length of the contracts to about age 35 for most workers. But what was happening is that during that time period, for a variety of reasons, whether it be disease or some of the very, very difficult conditions that people lived in at that time, the average longevity of folks was right around your mid-30s. So people did not want to stay as indentured servants until death, right, and not have any freedom. And so what was happening then as a result and in response to that, both white and black indentured servants started partnering up and demonstrating and forming coalitions to escape and to get out of those conditions and to start forming their own communities or groups or what have you. And this was obviously alarming to the landowners and the wealthy class, who then decided to address that by creating two classes of servants. One was your indentured servant class, made up of white people, and the other was chattel slavery, where they began to define black folks as less than human and as property. And that distinguished the difference between the two, and it also formed an opportunity for the landowners to increase in a much more devastating way the punishments for any folks that dared to escape who were black, and lessen the punishments against the white indentured servants. So that created a divide that lasted throughout the remainder of our history. And so chattel slavery, the treatment of black folks as property, as less than human, was a uniquely American invention that was very different than the servitude that had existed in the past. As troubling as that servitude was, it was nowhere near the level that chattel slavery reached. And so we reached 1776. We reached a period where the colonies were declaring independence from England, and the English actually responded in an interesting way to this movement. One Englishman captured the sentiment among many English leaders, Thomas Day, when he wrote that something ridiculous in nature, it is something ridiculous in nature to see an American patriot signing resolutions of independence with one hand while holding a whip over enslaved Africans with the other. Now, the Brits were also involved in the slave trade, but by this point, in 1776, the abolition movement and the ending of slavery was really, really gaining a lot of momentum, such that by the early 1800s, I think it was 1803, 1805, England had outlawed the slave trade. And so there was that divide that was happening there as well. So race was integral in that. And the 1619 Project gets into a lot of this. So if you're not familiar with it, you could find the 1619 Project as a podcast, and you can find the articles online as well through the New York Times. But the project gets into this time period, and it talks about how part of the issue in the looking for independence from England was that England was starting to move away from using slavery, and chattel slavery in particular, to run economies. And the United States wanted to maintain the independence to keep slavery, to keep their economy moving. And so it was a very insignificant factor. There's a great documentary, if you're interested in it. It came out about 2007 or so, by Katrina Brown. And Katrina Brown is a individual who was a member of the DeWolf family, who at one time was the largest slave-owning family in American history. And that wealth that they generated from the slave trade has helped generations to this day stay very wealthy in this society. And that's another aspect of slavery that we don't have time to get into tonight, but so many of our universities, there are at least a dozen or more fairly well-known banks and corporations that exist today that are huge, that started and gained their wealth through the slave trade, have maintained that wealth. This documentary gets into a lot of that, which is really powerful, and I urge you to check that out if you have a chance. But that took us through a time period where race was still central, and so much so that you had southern states and northern states at odds with one another on how this should continue in terms of slavery. And we fought a civil war over slavery. And so the Civil War is an interesting moment in our history because it is defined in interesting ways depending on where you're at in the country. There are still books to this day, I'm told by friends of mine that live down south, that call this era the War of Northern Aggression, that the northern states and the dictatorial Abraham Lincoln was trying to take away the rights of southern states and the rights of southern states to have autonomy over how they operated and engaged in their everyday economy, political life, and so forth. And these different opinions are interesting because there is, obviously with history, there is a personal investment for folks to have their narrative dominate the actual narrative and be the story that's told. And we often hear that history is written by the victors, but in this instance, it's very easy to understand what the Civil War was all about because the southern states themselves told us what it was about. They wrote an entire constitution that told the world about their desire to start a Confederate States of America that was ordained by God and was there to establish their states as one where Black people were subservient to white people, very simply, and that this institution of slavery, actually serving white people, was the only purpose Black people should be here. In fact, Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, specifically said that our new government is founded upon exactly the opposite ideas, referencing the ideas of other formations of other countries. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. He says specifically that this, our new government, is actually the first in the history of the world based upon that truth, right? This truth has been slow in the process of development, like all of the truth in the various departments of science. And I would agree with that. It was slow to develop because it's not rooted in any real science, right? But that was the foundation, right? And the states were unified in these messages. They told us in their articles of secession that they specifically regarded the African race as inferior, that they had no right or place to be within the white colonies whatsoever, unless it was to be there to serve the dominant race. That was the only way that their existence was tolerable. So Texas told us this, Mississippi told us this, South Carolina told us this, Georgia, Louisiana, and on, Tennessee. So we know exactly why the Civil War started. We know exactly why the states seceded. And there were other issues, no doubt as well, but this was the central issue that started the Civil War very, very clearly based on the historical information that we know the states gave us themselves. And so race, while this was happening, race was playing a role also in removing what were deemed to be inferior, uncivilized, unchristian heathens from millions upon millions of acres and miles of land west of the Mississippi River. And so when Native Americans had a relationship with white colonists from the moment that they landed on the shores of the current United States, and anytime that Native tribes attempted to form treaties with white Europeans, they were broken. In fact, the United States as a government signed over 500 treaties with Native tribes, and all 500 plus were broken by the United States government. So when folks are seen as inferior, when you have newspaper editorials and leaders of the country saying that small groups of tribes have no right to have this much land or they don't deserve this, it was justification quite often, and sometimes biblical justification through the idea of manifest destiny, that these folks just need to be removed if they can't be civilized. And so you had Native tribes who had basically had the various estimates from either 8 million to 80 million, depending on which historian you're reading, in numbers in the Americas, especially in North America, were wiped out. We had about 250,000, 250,000 Native Americans remaining by the end of the 1800s. And so a significant percentage, the vast majority of folks were perished because of disease. But we also know that the infestation and the passing of diseased blankets and other government practices that were designed to not exactly support Native Americans were also practices that people engaged in. And we also had our government engage in what is now known as ethnic cleansing. So basically, Native Americans were told that the language of their people, the religions that they worshiped, the traditions and the customs that they held were not just wrong, they were evil. They needed to be rid of them. And in order to ensure that that would happen in future generations, children were taken, mass amounts of children were taken from their families throughout the 1800s and put into boarding schools in order to really wipe out their traditions and their culture, again, called ethnic cleansing, which is a human rights violation right now in the United Nations. Throughout this time period as well, the mid-1800s, the United States was the aggressor in starting a war with Mexico, again, in an effort to acquire land and resources. And so this map, which is prior to 1845, shows the territory of Mexico, which included modern day Texas. I don't know if you can see my mouse here, but Texas and parts of Oklahoma, what is now New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, southern Idaho, Oregon. So this was all Mexico, right? There's a reason why so many cities, for example, in California are called Los Angeles, San Diego, right? It's San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Francisco. All these names are all Spanish names that predate the creation of the United States and were created when the Spanish arrived in the 15 and 1600s. And so that was huge in terms of the United States moving forward and having ambitions to really be an imperial world power. And so Mexico lost half of its territory in the War of 1845, and the young United States continued to grow and acquire resources to support its economic movement forward. But to this day, Native tribes continue to face the same exact issues that they faced for 500 years since Columbus arrived. And so the most recent, most notable examples, if any of you have been following the news, have been the building of pipelines, oil pipelines through Native reservations. The most famous has been the Standing Rock Reservation, which had a standoff a few years ago. I actually spent the weekend out there with the folks who were resisting the pipeline, and it was a very moving and powerful experience for me to really be among people who, when I heard them speak about the reasons they were there and what they were trying to prevent, I might as well have been in 1840, because the same exact reasons of holding on to our homes, holding on to our traditions, having safe drinking water and a future that we can depend on through the land was being taken away for profit, right? So that is a reality that has existed for Native Americans as well. So in 1865, at the end of the Civil War, when slavery was officially ended, African Americans finally found themselves free. But there was a lot of unknowns that came with that freedom. And so with that freedom came the opportunity to create new communities, to start movement forward. And actually within the first few years after the Civil War, you had a couple hundred folks in state legislatures that were African American who were voted in. And you actually had a period of time just after the Civil War where there was a real chance for Black folks and African Americans to actually participate as equals in a society and have that opportunity to form the communities and the businesses and the careers and the ideas and the inventions that were afforded to others. But that moment was squandered when, upon Abraham Lincoln's death, Andrew Johnson became president. And Johnson was not supportive of Black rights in many ways. And through his leadership, there was movements to turn a blind eye and to grant states the rights to kind of, process how this would move forward and what rights Blacks would have exactly in their own states. And this is where the Jim Crow laws came in and other segregationist laws came in. And you actually had these elected officials who were Black Americans, new citizens, newly voted in, who were forcibly, violently kicked out of their positions. It was basically a coup that happened across southern states, and you had white southern folks take over. While this was happening as well, you had laws being put into place that I'm going to be talking in a little bit, called the Black Codes, which also significantly harmed Black communities. But in the time period after the Civil War until the late 1800s, the amount of innovation and creativity and inventions and leadership and folks in the Black communities that came forth and just contributed immediately to American society was staggering when you think about what had preceded for 290 years before freedom. When I think about the invention of scientific discoveries, or the creation of Black colleges and universities because Black folks were not allowed to enter white colleges and universities, and having these run and having them be efficient and be just as valid as any other institution. The creation of new styles of music like jazz, the innovation and the resilience to be able to do all of that in a span of about 50 years after freedom from 1870 to 1920 is just staggering when you think about the lack of any kind of support in foundation that Black Americans had prior to that. But despite this success, despite moving forward, and despite having communities that were actually beginning to thrive, you actually had Black communities starting to really demonstrate that the American dream might actually be possible. You had it taken away, and there was a tendency to backlash from white communities. It was no coincidence that shortly after the Civil War, we saw the birth of the Ku Klux Klan. And then as that Klan faded by 1900, they had a rebirth in the 19 teens and in the 1920s as white sentiment toward Black Americans continued to be hostile. And this is an image here of North Tulsa, Oklahoma, that you may have heard of recently, that had some news recently that people were unaware of the history of North Tulsa. And this area was known as Black Wall Street. And in 1921, Black Wall Street was burned to the ground by a mob of over 300 white folks who had responded to an incident that had occurred in a violent way and had burned down hundreds of businesses, homes were destroyed, churches were destroyed, and decades of economic growth that had actually led to a Black wealthy class and Black upper middle class in this region of the country was gone. And to this day, economically, North Tulsa has not recovered. The Black communities there have not recovered to the extent that they had in the 1920s, 1921. And so that's part of our history. And these massacres of Black folks happened all across the country as backlashes happened. As communities started to show even a hint of integration, white communities responded by attacking in mass numbers or through lynchings or through the destruction of schools and businesses. And over again, we saw that as Black Americans started to take one step forward, they had to go 3 steps back because of violent terrorism that occurred. And you see the majority of these taking place in the South. By 1920, 90+% of Black Americans lived in the South, in the traditional old South, the old Confederacy. By 1970, it was 50-50, people living in the North and South among African Americans, because what had happened starting in 1920, because of these massacres, because of the terrorist activity of the Klan that were terrorizing families night after night in some regions, people escaped the racial terror that was happening. They had to go somewhere else where they felt like they can have an economic head start, an economic opportunity of some kind. And so you saw cities like Detroit, Cleveland, Chicago, Indianapolis, Minneapolis, and others start to see an infusion of what was called the Great Migration. And we saw Black families moving north. And so to have economic opportunity, but also to escape the racial terror that had continued to happen for decades. And the racial antagonism didn't fade in the 1920s either, or 30s or 40s. This is an image of South Philadelphia in 1985. 1985, I was in high school, not knowing that this was happening. I was all happy about the 85 Bears. That was what was happening in my life. Not knowing that the Philadelphia Police Department had dropped a bomb on several homes that were housing a group called the MOVE movement. This group called MOVE was a Black organization that believed in communal living and wanted to have their own economic little enclave in this neighborhood and to operate through a separate set of rules. And as a result of their tension with the police decided to end the standoff that they had with them by dropping a bomb on the neighborhood. And it not only killed a few MOVE members, but it also destroyed the homes of other folks that had nothing to do with MOVE. So Black communities having bombs dropped on them in American cities, part of our heritage. And so after the 1920s, again, the Klan was picking up in steam again. And we know that the Jim Crow era had started in the 1860s, 1870s. And that Jim Crow era, which was basically the era of segregation, of separate but equal, basically saying that white folks saying to Black folks, okay, you want to be equal? You can be equal, but you have to be equal over there. You want to be equal and have a water fountain? You use that water fountain, not my water fountain. And that lasted for 100 years. And so this was the dehumanization that Black folks had to endure. This was the reason Rosa Parks did not want to, stand up, and give up her seat, because it was the dehumanization that was happening on a daily basis. And so when I see the history that I've just shared, and I see some of the governmental policies, and I see some of the bigger issues that happen that might show up in history books, what's not captured in that history is just what it's like in everyday life. So I also like to see history, or at least imagine history, through the lens of folks like us on this call. No one knows who I am publicly, and we are, as far as I know, outside of Veronica, we don't have any rock stars here, right? So we have everyday life that we go through, right? I take my family, I have 3 teenage kids. We like to go to restaurants. We like to go to see the movies. If I go to the drugstore to get some snacks or a birthday card, what's that like, right? And what was it like back then? What were the messages being given that had racial connotations that continued to send messages through our society that Black people and brown people were inferior, right? So this is something I wanted to explore as well. And I imagined, for example, and I'm going to give another warning here, that some of the images we're going to see are a little bit rough. So if I wanted to go to a restaurant or a hotel, I had to have a separate waiting room if I was a person of color, especially if I was Black. I had to drink from a separate water fountain. Part of our heritage, right? If I was Japanese, looking for a home in a certain neighborhood, I might encounter a message like this. In the 1950s, this sign in Dallas, Texas, made clear who was not welcome, lumping the 3 groups there as if they were all animals. So I don't know how many of you have heard of the practice of redlining or blockbusting. We don't have time to get into it tonight, but in a nutshell, banks, realtors, law enforcement, community leaders, local politicians, all were complicit and often colluded to keep communities of color separate and lacking opportunity and resource. And redlining was a way that banks would take a map of, let's say, Chicago, and draw a red line around certain neighborhoods. And the neighborhoods that they drew red lines around were Black and brown neighborhoods. And they've deemed those to be folks that they did not want to offer any loans to. Loans might mean business advancement. It might mean access to homes. And they were not interested in that. And so they lent out to white communities. And the reason why we have segregated cities today is because of redlining and the decisions that were made politically and economically during much of America's history. So I urge you to get more familiar with this history, which we don't have time to get into tonight. But other ways that the government discriminated, local and federal, discriminated against people of color included, home loans, business loans, or also the GI Bill. GI Bill is very well known. Veterans who serve and give up and sacrifice so much, being given the opportunity to either get low interest home loans or to have school paid for, college paid for. Huge benefit that was so important to creating the middle class after World War II. And one thing among many that is probably not very well known about the GI Bill was that over 98% of the recipients of the GI Bill from 1945 or so, when it first got enacted, until the early 70s, were white veterans. The reason why is because as this bill was being discussed in Congress and when President Truman was thinking of signing, the Southern Dixiecrats would not agree to this unless they had the autonomy to determine who received it or not. And so in order to get the votes necessary to pass the GI Bill through, some concessions were made. It was left up to the states to basically facilitate the distribution of this money. And what you had was, throughout most of the country, not just in the South, Black veterans being denied for a variety of different reasons these loans, and over 98% going to white vets during this time period. So another way that systematic white supremacist policies advantaged white folks over Black folks, despite the sacrifice that they all made. We also have the reality of sundown towns. There's actually a text that I highly recommend by James Lowen called Sundown Towns, that basically highlights the history of another reality that folks don't consider that was hugely impactful to the ability of Black and brown communities to advance and move forward in our society. So you had since the beginning of our country's history, but well into the 1990s, towns all across the country, hundreds of towns that basically had either local ordinances or laws, or they were unwritten, that said basically if you were a person of color, you needed to be out by sundown. And so specifically, they were set up this way for a couple of reasons. Local small businesses or small town restaurants could benefit from having Black and brown folks who usually worked at a lower wage come in and work throughout the day and work at a restaurant or a facility that required very intense manual labor and get the work out of folks, but then they would have to leave by sundown. So imagine being a person of color throughout almost the entirety of our history, thinking about where you might want to buy a home, where I might want to start my own business, where I might want to send my kids to school, and not having any choices because you couldn't be somewhere after sundown. And I highly recommend this book because you might be surprised to find out where these towns existed. And I know for me, I was shocked. I live in Gurnee, Illinois, which is in a suburb just an hour north of Chicago. How many of the suburbs in this area were sundown towns well into the late 60s, early 70s? And so not long ago, right? So very, very important aspect of our history that, again, was another factor that delineated who had access fully and who had only partial access or very little or no access at all. And by the way, guess who enforced these ordinances and these policies or these unwritten rules? It was always law enforcement. And we can't get into the law enforcement issue tonight, but that has a long, long history. And if you're addressing the issue of law enforcement and Black communities today, and you don't take into context a long history that's existed there, you're not going to get very far in that dialogue. So we have to learn the history of that issue as well. I mentioned earlier the Black codes, which were codes that basically and laws that were designed to really address the post-Civil War era and the real insistence on the South of really having free labor. And so after the Civil War, and because the Black legislators were kicked out and white legislators came in, they wrote new laws that basically criminalized a lot of activity like loitering or vagrancy, all these very, very, nonviolent, very nitpicky laws that were put into place, but resulted in jail time for Black Americans. And so one thing to note about that is if you're unfamiliar with the documentary 13th, which is on Netflix, it's also available right now this month on YouTube. 13th details the history of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. But it didn't use that language that it abolished slavery. In a nutshell, what the 13th Amendment said is that human beings cannot be kept as free labor anymore unless it's penalty for a crime that was committed and criminal punishment. So in essence, what it meant is if you commit a crime and you go to jail, we can use you for free labor. And so slavery never really went away in many ways because immediately that was exploited, especially in the South, to just round up and take African Americans in by the hundreds and getting them on chain gangs and filling the prisons with free labor that really benefited large companies and the old South, the old slave owners as well. So these Black codes were a part of our history that also had a huge impact on the movement forward for Black Americans. I say on this slide that it's as American as apple pie, racism. The reason I say that is, as we can see so far, it's been interwoven into every piece we've talked about so far, but it was also interwoven into our everyday life. Like I said earlier, if I wanted to go to the grocery store or the drugstore, what would I see? What images would I see in the old America that existed, that informed who belonged and who didn't belong? And I'm gonna warn you once again that the images I'm gonna show here are quite racist. They're very difficult to view. And I'm gonna move forward just giving you that advance notice because it's gonna help inform and help us understand, I believe, how we got to where we're at today and why we have such an anti-Black history that we have to own at some point. So I mentioned earlier, if I went to the store and I wanted to get, let's say, a Valentine's Day card, I wanted to get one for my wife, and I hit the local small town drugstore or city corner drugstore, what might I see if I had a choice of Valentine's Day cards? Well, between 1900 in the 1930s, here's what some of the cards might be that I encounter. So I might have this card that I come across. Or I might see one like this. Or I might see a few like this. Or I might see one that says this. And so unashamed were these card makers that I might even see one that looks like this. It was so ingrained in our society, it was such an afterthought that Black people were inferior that no one batted an eye in general to these things. Now, you had a lot of folks at the margins of our society protesting these things, and their voices are present in some of the history books that are out there, but the vast majority didn't bat an eye to this. If I went to a restaurant, I might come across a chain called the Coon Chicken Inn, which was famous and well known throughout the country, but had, I think its most successful restaurants in Seattle, Portland, Salt Lake City. And this was what it looked like during that era. This was some of their advertisements as well. You had the existence of Darky toothpaste in the 1930s to the present, and this was in Southeast Asia, but from an American-owned company. And currently, the company that owns it is Colgate-Palmolive. It is now known as Darlie toothpaste, but these were its origins. And because of the recent protests against George Floyd, or against what happened to George Floyd, and to support Black Lives Matter, Colgate-Palmolive just announced about a week and a half ago, or almost 2 weeks ago, that they will work to review and further evolve all aspects of their brand, including the brand name. And again, this is in Southeast Asia right now. So they're having a little moment right now where they're starting to maybe realize that something should change. Washing powder for dishes and for silverware was advertised through the Gold Dust twins for about 50 years. In Australia in the 50s, you had these products available. One was a candy and another one was soap pads. This was a popular tobacco in the United States for about 80 years. You can see the name of it. You had games like the Jolly Darky game that were available for a few decades. You had a piggy bank or somewhere to put your money for kids as well. That was something you might come across at a store. At carnivals and at circuses, you had a popular game in the 1940s and 50s where somebody either in blackface or someone who was Black was the target of being struck, and that was part of the game, was to hit a person. You had axle grease available. And you had Aunt Jemima's pancake flour that was from that era and started out as a, basically a stereotype of the mammy servant, house servant. And Aunt Jemima evolved quite a bit over decades, so much so that you may have heard the news last week that the company that owns Aunt Jemima is now changing that product. And so it took 130 years, but they kind of figured it out, as did Uncle Ben's, who also announced that they were changing the image of the brand. So these all have their roots in a racialized, highly racialized period in American history. And so this is what caused, from day one, Black Americans to make good trouble, as John Lewis has said, to engage in movements, to demand civil rights, to demand equal rights, to demand the opportunity to be full human beings and citizens in a society that had a constitution that claimed that that's what it was supposed to be. And yet for 100 years after slavery ended, African Americans could not move forward in so many parts of the country. They could not vote. They could not participate. And when I show this image, quite often I'll ask audiences, what do you see here? And the responses I usually get include inspiration, hope. You could see Dr. King here. He has a smile. It seems like he's enthusiastic or just in a good place, just feeling positive, right? You see Coretta with a half smile going. You see other people smiling. They seem inspired. They seem together, unified, right? And it's interesting that when you think about Dr. King, I think Dr. King is, quite frankly, the representative of civil rights and equal rights in our country's history. When people think about human rights in America, who's the first person many people think of? It usually is Martin Luther King Jr. So much so that last year in 2019, several polls, including this one here, found that Martin Luther King Jr. has a 90% favorability rating in America, right? And 7 in 10 Americans feel like the civil rights movement made things better in this country. You know, so it's interesting to see that Martin Luther King Jr. very beloved in our society, and rightfully so for many reasons. But what's also interesting, and if you're unaware of this, was during King's time, this is how people responded to him and to the civil rights movement. This is what people were saying in response to Black folks saying we want equality. When Black folks said, I want to have integrated schools, I don't want separate schools because we have inferior resources and we have no funds to improve our schools, white communities responded by saying, we don't want you here. We want to keep our schools white. And so when Brown versus Board of Education was ruled by the Supreme Court in 1954, which basically said that segregation was unlawful, this was the response to that. This was the response. And we saw this in the upper left-hand corner over here. You see the hostility toward African Americans entering into schools. You see comments like the whites have rights too, which is something that I've heard in recent years as well. What about white people? In fact, some recent polling on racial discrimination in our society right now shows that almost half or slightly more than half of white Americans believe that racism against white people is just as bad as racism against Black folks, and that Black folks have no one to blame but themselves for their lack of progress. That's in some very recent research and polling that's been done. And people saying that, what about white people? What about our rights, right? That was around back then as well. Back then they were saying that the rights of white people should be to have my kids go to school with who I want them to go to school with. And the government's making me integrate when I don't want to integrate, right? So that was the argument back then. And they often use Bible chapters to support their arguments. Here on the lower left-hand side with this sign, 2 Peter 12, 1-2, Jeremiah chapter 11. So the arguments that were being made in the 1950s and 60s. Martin Luther King Jr., the 90% approval rating that we see today, here are some of the responses he got back then. He was being seen as somebody who was causing trouble, that he was starting to cause division. Why are you so interested in dividing America? Why are you causing this trouble? Why are you trying to, divide the country for whatever reason? Dr. King, I always admired you, but now you seem to be only interested in, putting Black and white against each other. Dr. King, what's this Black power business, right? Some of the mail that Dr. King received. Gallup did some polling in the early 60s, as did Pew, on the rights, or on the attitudes of Americans toward the civil rights movement. And here's some of the results that they got in polling. That 60% felt that the civil rights rally, the March on Washington, the march that actually had the famous I Have a Dream speech, 60% of Americans had an unfavorable opinion of that. Do you approve or disapprove of the Freedom Riders? 61% disapproved of the Freedom Riders. The lunchroom sit-ins, the freedom buses. And this was definitely disproportionately tilted with white Americans in higher numbers disapproving of these as well. So in the moment it was happening, people were not supportive. So much so that by the time Dr. King was killed, his approval rating among Americans was right around 30% or under 30%, depending on which poll you were looking at. Dr. King was called the most notorious liar in American history by J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI. He was called a great threat to our way of life. He was near the top of the FBI's most wanted or watched list. He was surveilled for years because he was seen as an absolute threat to the system. This is the Martin Luther King Jr. who has a 90% approval rating. This is what he endured and lived through while he was alive. Now, we won't get into this too much, but on the right-hand side, the polling that was done during that time also gets into the attitudes. And I mentioned earlier how some of the recent polling in the last couple of years, 2018, 2019, showed that white Americans felt that Black Americans were just as much to blame for their own circumstances as anyone else. Well, guess what was happening in June of 1968 when polling was done? Asked whether the Negroes are being treated in this community the same as whites, or whites are not very well or badly. 73% of white folks in these polls insisted that they were being treated the same. And only 3% felt that they were treated badly in 1968. Think about that. 58% of white folks believed that Black folks themselves were more to blame than white people for the present conditions in which they were treated badly. And 58% of white folks believed that the present condition that Black folks found themselves in was their own fault, compared to only 23% who felt white folks were more to blame. So it seems like there's been a constant disconnect between the two worlds, between white and Black, and what the experiences have been. And white folks not necessarily believing what Black folks are enduring, or what they've had to endure. But as these moments were happening in the 1960s, you saw other folks speak out. Famously, Muhammad Ali, heavyweight champion of the world in 1967, refused to serve the United States Army and go to Vietnam to fight in the war. He was stripped of his heavyweight title at the time and had to serve some prison time as well. And here he is in 1967 in Cleveland, announcing that he was not going to participate. And with him are Jim Brown, NFL Hall of Famer, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, was Lou Alcindor back then, future Hall of Fame basketball player. He had Bill Russell, and behind them, other NFL and other sport athletes who were there to support Ali and to speak out. Now you can only imagine in our society how these athletes might have been perceived for standing up for their beliefs against what they believe was an unjust system. They might have responded back then, and they did respond, much like folks today have responded to this guy. Colin Kaepernick famously has won a recent civil case against the NFL in which or didn't win a case, I should say, was settled in a collusion case, which was basically trying to address whether or not he was kept out of the league after his protests. And so he has become the most famous figure among many who have spoken out against current injustices that are happening with the Black Lives Matter movement. But I would urge you, if you have the time and energy, to go look at the criticisms of Kaepernick that have been put out there over the last few years, what's been said by political leaders, by folks in the media, and compare that language side by side with the stuff we saw said about King. And you might be surprised at how similar it is. The same responses, same reactions. And then you have the beloved Jackie Robinson, who everybody seems to love. I think his approval rating is higher than Jesus. Everybody loves Jackie Robinson. And so Jackie Robinson, in his autobiography, even talked about, what his experience was like as a Black American. And he talked about how he was in a moment when he was standing there at his first World Series, and he was kind of thinking about his life and thinking about, how his life had transpired. And in 1972, as he looked back at that first World Series and he thought about his experience in Major League Baseball, and he thought about what it was like to be Black in America, he concluded that as he writes 20 years later after his first World Series, that he cannot stand and sing the anthem. He cannot salute the flag. I know that I am a Black man in a white world. In 1972, in 1947, at my birth in 1919, I know that I never had it made. It's a very powerful comment from an individual who is seen as a beacon of breaking the color barrier, as someone who showed the fortitude and the strength and the confidence to move the country in a positive way by breaking the color barrier in baseball. And as he says in this statement throughout, maybe I should be, grateful for this, but I can't be because my experiences have been too hard. So much so that even he wouldn't stand for the flag. So what does that tell us? Oftentimes in these types of presentations and conversations that we have as we move forward, it's also customary to view issues of racism as something that used to happen in America, as something that was in the past. But really it isn't, and it hasn't changed, and I'm going to demonstrate why. I don't know how many of you have been paying attention to some folks who seem to be the gatekeepers of what Black folks can or can't do in our society, but we have the Barbecue Beckys and the Amy Coopers and folks who have made headlines in recent years because police have been called in instances when Black people have been barbecuing in a park, or selling bottled water on the side of a street, or swimming in a swimming pool in a condominium association that they lived in, or on and on and on, shopping at a grocery store, or bird watching in Central Park with what happened with Amy Cooper. And so these instances demonstrate how unconscious bias quite often works, and how in the minds of some folks, if the immediate reaction is to see somebody and think, do they belong here? What are they doing here? Why, maybe they're doing something suspicious, and it can be as simple as just bird watching. The inclination is to see folks as a threat, and then to threaten to call the police on folks. And these have been part of Black experiences in America since day one. The idea of criminality, the idea that folks cannot be trusted or don't belong. And this has led to Black Lives Matter as a movement, and movements around campuses around the country, through some Greek organizations and others that are demanding equity and equal rights, and that these issues be addressed. Because the issues, much like in the past when Dr. King was demanding equality and justice and the civil rights movement was demanding equal rights and justice, there has been a white backlash to it today as well. And these are images from 2016 of folks at protesting Muslim rights. You have on the upper right-hand corner here, a billboard that showed up in Alabama off an interstate highway that shows the image of Alabama state troopers approaching John Lewis and the marchers crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. And this is the famous Bloody Sunday scene where the troopers beat up and just decimated these people and just caused numerous injuries and hospitalizations. And that moment has the message, "Make America Great Again" on it. Here you have "Make America White Again." This was a billboard off of I-24 outside of Nashville in 2016. If you go to Rick Tyler for Congress today and that website, you'll see the unabashed "Make America White Again" claims and the reasons why America needs to be white again. There continues to be a backlash as more and more historically marginalized and underrepresented people gain access and equity. We see the backlash because for people who have always been privileged, equality for others feels like oppression. And it's led to white supremacist groups, neo-Nazi groups, and similar groups like that who have started putting up billboards and advertisements around the country warning of the dangers of an integrated society, of a diverse society. That when I say I want to be anti-racist, that's something that seems to be code word for anti-white. That when you have Muslim communities starting to live out the American dream, that suddenly we're going to have Sharia law take place and set foot. That diversity, the actual inclusion of people of different backgrounds, really means chasing down the last white person. These are messages that are showing up across America in the last 4 to 5 years. And these movements have coincided with increases in homophobia, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, fear of immigrants, and the frequent use of the phrase, "we need to take our country back." And so we have communities, groups responding with fear to the integration and the further integration and access of equal rights for more Americans. It's a movement that has continued to happen more and more as we've seen that grow. This is the University of Virginia 3 years ago. This is the well-known event that resulted in the death of Heather Heyer the next day at a rally that took place. And these were the folks that marched at the University of Virginia with these tiki torches. They were proclaimed white supremacists who had no fear of showing their faces and participating and demanding that Jewish folks and people of color needed to leave and be out of this society. And in Greek life, you know, we see annually, multiple times and in multiple ways, things like this play out, where Black and brown communities are the subject of Halloween parties or other theme parties that denigrate and dehumanize other groups as something to be mocked and made fun of. And you have even, you know, down here in this image here, a Klan member with a noose and a rope tied around someone in blackface with a Confederate flag in the background. And you had a famous image that came out at Halloween in 2014. I can't remember what university this was at, but this was shortly after Trayvon Martin had been killed. And if you're unfamiliar with the Trayvon Martin story, that was the moment in our history that basically started the Black Lives Matter movement. And here you have a kid in blackface with a bloody shirt being Trayvon Martin being shot by George Zimmerman, the neighborhood watch guy. You know, so again, just how these things play out, right? How do we show up and what are we seeing happen on college campuses around the country? And so there's a little link here that and I'm happy to share this presentation, obviously, and I know it's being recorded tonight, so you're more than welcome to get to this website, but there are, you know, this study, but there are multiple studies out there of the role Greek life has played, especially fraternities and sororities since their beginning, in creating an anti-white or a pro-white, a white supremacist, anti-Black culture. The foundations of American education were also tied into anti-Blackness and keeping Black folks out. And so if we are to move forward, there are some suggestions here from these authors, but there are many more works you can find on your own on how to be an organization that is one that cultivates inclusivity and equity, and at the same time does it by owning our history. We as Greek you all, I should say, I'm not Greek, but as Greek organizations, we in higher education have to all own our history, whether as higher education institutions or as Greek organizations. We have to own the history of exclusion that has happened. Veronica knows this very well at Carthage College, which was founded in 1847. We had, like every other school, a history of being exclusive and prohibiting Black and brown folks from attending. Our first Black graduate from Carthage College did not happen until 1946. Next year will be the 75th anniversary of that moment. And so we're planning lots of events around that, but we're also planning events to acknowledge our complicity in white supremacy, the white supremacy that kept folks out for almost 100 years prior to 1946. That we have to acknowledge that and own it so that we can create a better future for the next 100 years and beyond. So what can your organization do to own its own history? How have you been exclusive of others, or how have you excluded others? And what have you done to be inclusive as you've moved forward? Those are important conversations you have to have moving forward. And you have to own that history. Because over and over again, we've seen history repeat itself. And we've seen marches from the 1960s, especially this image here in South Carolina in 1960, February 1st, when you had 4 college freshmen basically put their lives on the line in many ways to sit at a lunch counter and decide whether or not they wanted to stand for justice. And you have University of Missouri here in 2015 of folks standing up to support Black lives. So the moments that exist are happening right now where we can do something. And as conversation that's been fairly visible recently has been brought up, you know, what I have been like in the civil rights movement, what might have I been like during, you know, Reconstruction after the Civil War? Would I have spoken out? Would I have done something for racial justice? Well, to answer that question, I would say, what are you doing now? You know, how would you have shown up during the civil rights movement? you're doing it right now. So if you stay quiet or really don't get engaged, and maybe you try not to be racist yourself, but really don't say much, you probably would have done the same thing in 1960. But is it enough? That's a question we all have to ask ourselves. And systemic racism, which is at the heart of all this, is not just in the past. Here are some bits of information for you to consider of the world that we live in today with anti-Black hiring. When we talk about the numbers of African Americans that are unarmed that are killed by police, in 2015 was the deadliest year to date. 104 folks were killed by police that were unarmed. During the Jim Crow era, for example, America averaged 38 lynchings a year. Unarmed African Americans are 2 times more likely than whites to be shot by police. We had the Dylan Roof hate crime in 2015, and on and on. And it's in everyday life as well. Home and mortgage lenders have now paid hundreds of millions of dollars in legal fees to African Americans who were denied loans and charged higher interest rates despite having the exact same credit scores and incomes than whites. Black children are 4 times as likely to be suspended from school than white kids for the exact same behaviors and mistakes. That's that one and the next one, with Black girls being twice as likely to be suspended from school, comes from Yale University and the Equal Justice Initiative. They're interested in those studies. The way we treat drug use, for decades, we treated the use of crack cocaine as a criminal act, needed to be punished by imprisonment. And now we have the opioid crisis, which is predominantly and disproportionately affecting white communities, being treated as a public health issue rather than jail time. And it showed that we could have treated the crack issue as a public health issue as well, right? So you have all these realities that have been a part of shaping the experiences of Black and brown communities. When it comes to policing, this is a report put out I think in the Obama administration's Justice Department the last year that they were in office, of policing in the United States, from profiling to use of force to sexual misconduct and to accountability or lack of accountability. Some of the things that are happening in policing that have disproportionately affected Black and brown communities today. Okay, so you have those realities that exist. And when you look at the summary of the Black experience in America, it reminds me of the Monopoly example. I don't know if you're familiar with the game Monopoly, but in that game, it's all about accumulating wealth and property. And if you had 3 players who were white and 1 who was Black playing that game, and for the first hour of the game or the first 5 hours of the game, the Black player could not play at all, they're not going to get much of a start. And that's been much of American history for Black America. And again, as these things have moved forward, Black communities, brown communities have come together to try to address these issues with the creation of groups like Campaign Zero or Black Lives Matter. And again, as we've seen both in the 60s with those images of whites-only schools, as we saw with the backlash to what's happening in recent years, the Black Lives Matter itself its movement itself has received a backlash. That after Black Lives Matter was created, another new movement was created to counter it. A movement that had not existed before until it was a counter to Black Lives Matter. So again, as we've seen throughout history, as Black communities and brown communities continue to insist upon, demand equal rights, demand the end to systematic racism, the response is to quiet them down with images or phrases like this phrase, which also came about after Black Lives Matter was created. And what folks don't understand is that when folks say all lives matter, they're missing the point. And they're not listening. And we need to listen. Because this is what it's trying to call attention to. This is the point of Black Lives Matter. I stated at the beginning that so many of these issues exist today, and I'm convinced in large part to very good people who don't know that they might be contributing to a society that is inequitable. And in large part, I attribute that to the philosophy or the ideology of being colorblind. That the best intentions of people to not see color, that I don't see color, I only see the human being, is a really well-intentioned idea that has very, very devastating results. And if I know that people of goodwill, if they hear that they want to be colorblind, but if they hear that in doing so it might cause harm, I know people who are good would be upset by that and want to change. And so I would make a plea to all of you tonight. If you say, I don't see color, to reconsider. Because as we've seen throughout this evening, color has had a huge, significant impact on how individuals have experienced America and our society. And if we are not open to that, then we are not open to hearing and validating the full experiences of human beings that we may care about. When we say to someone that I don't see your color, they may be hearing it as you saying, I don't see the issues you go through as important or different, or I don't want to hear something that implies that you're different, and that's a disservice to them. Jane Elliott, who's done a lot of great work for decades, said that when you say to a person of color, when I see you, I don't see you black. I just see everyone the same. Think about that. You don't have the right to say to a person, I do not see you as you are. I want to see you as I would be more comfortable seeing you. So when we're saying I don't see color, could it be more about my own comfort level with race rather than your reality? We have to ask ourselves that. Why? Because we know, based on what we saw tonight, and if we talk to Black and brown folks in communities around the country, we will know that quite often we have two different American experiences, and we have to be open to understanding those differences. Dr. King, Martin Luther King, among many of the things that made him end up at a 30% approval rating because people weren't liking what he said that white folks must be frankly said are not putting in a similar mass effort to educate themselves out of their racial ignorance. It is an aspect of their sense of superiority that the white people of America believe they have so little to learn. And he goes on to say that loose and easy language about equality, resonant resolutions about brotherhood fall pleasantly on the ear, but for the Negro there is a credibility gap he cannot overlook. He remembers that with each modest advance, the white population promptly raises the argument that the Negro has come far enough. Each step forward accents an ever-present tendency to backlash. And so to have that not happen, we need to listen as a society. We need to understand that the experiences of individuals and communities can be vastly different. And quite often they're not rooted in individual acts of prejudice or discrimination, but in the systems under which we operate. This includes the school to prison pipeline, which I'll briefly get through here. And we touched on it earlier with the school suspensions that we saw among Black boys and Black girls. Dr. Sean Harper and Edward Smith did a study a few years ago, 2016, I want to say, that looked at the disproportionate impact of K-12 suspensions and expulsions in 13 southern states. And they found that despite having a small percentage of the population be Black students made up the majority, in some instances by far, of expulsions and suspensions. And lots of reasons that are presented in the data for that. I mentioned earlier how it starts early. 4-year-old preschoolers expelled at a 50% rate higher than 3-year-olds, Black preschoolers more than white preschoolers, and so forth. Especially Black boys who are the target very early on. They're seen as more culpable and more guilty. They're seen as older as they are, and they're actually seen to feel less pain, interestingly enough. So to have these conversations, to work as communities, to work as a fraternal group, to really get together and really be authentic with one another, we have to be vulnerable. We have to allow folks to truly express how these barriers and realities impact us. We have to acknowledge and understand that we might have different experiences. True openness requires courage. It requires those who hold more power in a community to listen and to validate and to acknowledge that your experience might be different than my own. I need something I have something to learn here. And when that happens, when true communication happens and we are truly listening to one another, the possibility of liberation becomes more of a possibility and a reality. That those who are underrepresented in the community might actually feel like the majority actually is invested in me being a part of this. The majority is actually invested in finding out what my experience is like to make me feel, if I feel isolated or afraid, or what have you. But it takes work, and it takes a willingness to learn and to acknowledge that I might not know exactly what's going on. I might not be aware fully of what your experience is until I really hear it. And an unfortunate side effect that's happened in our society when people become vulnerable, when people offer the opportunity to be authentic. We've seen unfortunate, non-empathetic and, hurtful responses. Another way to reinforce that you don't matter or you don't belong is to just put it down, right? Is to just say, oh, you overly sensitive folks, you can't get over whatever. That's a reality that exists in all of our communities as well. And there's variations of this message that show up in every community. And all that does is just shut down more and reinforce the idea that some folks don't belong. So those who lead with integrity, those who have a real investment in one another as community members, move beyond that. They understand that marginalized communities have been over and over again ignored. They've been told that the things that they say their experience are not real. You're imagining it. Nobody's oppressing you. You're being overly sensitive. And folks are often dismissed. They are called, victims. You're being the victim. They're responded to with stereotypical commentary, and they're again shut down. It's another way for the power and privilege structure to maintain power by shutting down those who are seeking equal access. So we have a responsibility to listen. We have a responsibility to acknowledge. And why is there such a wide disconnect? Again, Dr. King says it better than I or anybody else could. Men often hate each other because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. They don't know each other because they cannot communicate, and they cannot communicate because they are separated. As we've seen, we have grown up, we have gone to school, we have moved forward in our lives in a segregated society, a society that was segregated intentionally. None of us on this call were around when slavery happened or Jim Crow. None of us built the structures that are in place in our society. But all of us were born into a world that has these structures still in place. And it's our responsibility to learn what those structures are in order to dismantle them. And it starts with us ourselves, right, as individuals. You have to be willing to just say, you know what, I think I know how the world works, but maybe I don't, and maybe I need to listen more. It's understanding that cultural saliency matters, that the lens of my lived experience is very, very different than yours. And it could very much be different because of my skin color, my culture, the way I worship, who I love, and what have you. So we have to be willing to listen. We have to understand that in the process of being a part of a school or a fraternity, that my identities and the multitude of identities that I carry, having the opportunity for those to grow and to be validated is super important to me being a full and complete human being. So however I identify, in the variety of different ways I identify, fostering that growth is very, very important. Having courageous conversations, saying no to colorblindness, and really getting to know individuals is super important. And even more importantly, a lot of organizations try to say that we're going to try to eliminate racism or homophobia or what have you. It's not going to be eliminated, but you can do a lot of things to reduce it greatly. And even more importantly, you could speak a language that says when these moments occur, in the rare instance that it does, we are prepared to have a way to respond and have good conversations and teach our community why this is not who we are. And being prepared to have those conversations when those moments occur, whether it's within your organization or what takes place from someone outside the organization but impacts your members. Having a readiness to preparing those conversations is incredibly important. And again, it goes back to having, as a community and as an organization and as individuals, creating awareness of these issues, having the vision to lead in different ways than has been led in the past, which takes courage, which means taking action, and it means that you are centering equity as part of what your values are for everyone. At Carthage College, where I work, we have students that are trying to get engaged and really be visible in terms of what they support and stand for. I mentioned earlier the 1619 project. I highly recommend you check that out to really get a real foundational knowledge of our founding of our country's history, to increase your knowledge of these issues. Here are some books I recommend. Again, you will have these slides, so you can have this with you. These are important because these are not, I'm not a fan of books that are written by, social commentators or, TV personalities or what have you. These are PhDs and researchers and folks who are experts in the field of history, of sociology, of how systems work, how people and communities have evolved over time, and they will really give a real strong context on how America's legal, social, economic, political structures were formed, how they've impacted communities, and what we can do to actually move forward in a better and more positive way. So with that said, I always like to end. Sorry, I got to get a little, homage to Biggie. But if you entered this conversation this evening, or this presentation, I should say, not knowing much about this, and this is new territory for you, now you know a little bit more. And I'm a believer that when you actually know a little bit more, we have a responsibility to start acting upon our values. So I didn't know about this stuff is a valid argument for those of us who weren't taught this, but now you know a little bit more. Now you have a little bit of a taste of it, and I would urge you to continue your education on these issues so you can be a contributor to a more equitable society, and we collectively can move toward a society that makes the American dream possible for everyone. So with my little homage here to Biggie, I'm going to end this here and then ask Veronica to step back in, and this might be a good opportunity to ask or answer some questions you may have. And I'm grateful that you spent the last hour 30 or so listening to me kind of go through a couple of 100 years of history in 90 minutes. So thank you for your attention. I'm super grateful for that.
Thank you so much, Roger. That was absolutely wonderful, and we appreciate the diligence and lots of information that you shared with us in 90 minutes. So I have a couple of questions, and the first would be, what would it look like for a white fraternity chapter to be a leader in a community in being anti-racist?
Yeah, I really think that it starts with your actions and how you show up every day. So the language you communicate, the values you put out. I know that every organization has its value statements and its mission and things you believe in. So to put that out there and to really express those values broadly, I would reach out to organizations, especially if you are currently a student on a college campus. Most students have a Black Student Union or groups like that present on your college campuses. I know what has worked really well at Carthage is we've had fraternities reach out to our BSUs and to our LGBT groups and to other groups to say, how can we support you? How can we be there to amplify your voices, to let folks know that we stand behind you? And so this past year, what was really cool is that one way that was done is during homecoming, people get their stations and their spots in the homecoming parade. And we had, I think the cultural organizations were like number 82 to number 89 or whatever, we were there. And the next thing you know, we had several Greek organizations come and decide they were just going to leave their spot, and they walked with us throughout the entire parade for homecoming. So they were showing solidarity with one another visibly, right? And not being ashamed to do so. So that, just one simple act like that among many that you can do. I would say that another thing you could do is to insist upon your organization to be trained in anti-racism training, to engage in safe zone LGBT training and things like that, that show that you are invested in learning more how you can be a supporter and actively engaged in creating a campus that works for everyone. So those are some simple steps I think you could take to get going. But I always say that extend the invitation, like go out and say, hey, how can we partner together? How can we be a part of your programs? If you know of programs that are coming up, can you give us your schedule so we can attend some of them? Those actions speak a lot louder than anything.
Thank you.
All right. I am going to jump in and ask this next one, Roger. We have a question from Chase Johnson. He's an alumnus from our Boise State chapter. And he says, Roger, how do you view the debate between violence and nonviolence and social justice movements? I think we have made social iconography out of MLK's and John Lewis's nonviolence, but theirs was met with violence. Today's movement are met with violence. I struggle with the pure dichotomy of violence and nonviolence in my own response to violent neo-Nazi groups I see here in the Northwest. Any thoughts?
Yeah, how much time we got?
Chase could probably talk about this all day, knowing Chase.
Yeah, I actually have friends up in Spokane at Gonzaga, and they created a Department of Hate Studies because of the violent groups that were up there back in the 90s and to this day. And so I can relate a little bit to that perspective out there. And you know, it's not a simple binary. I think that it's such a complicated issue that I think we have to, as a society and as organizations, be okay with some ambiguity of what is best. Because if I were to talk to 1,000 people, I would say almost all of them, if not all of them, would say violent action as a first response is not what I would prefer. And I think that, you know, and I don't prefer, I mean, all the people that I consider to be heroes in my life, for the most part, advocated nonviolence. That said, Martin Luther King himself talked about riots being the language of the unheard. Martin Luther King himself was as nonviolent as anyone and was assassinated, right? So how do you handle these issues? What do you advocate for? I don't have the answer to that. I think that it's one of those things that has to be an ongoing dialogue and conversation. And there has to be a real discussion about the consequences of our actions. There has to be a real conversation about what kind of example we want to demonstrate. But at the same time, it should be centered on what is necessary to make the movement go forward. You know, you've had one school of thought with Malcolm X who said, by any means necessary. And you have other schools of thought that are nonviolent and those in between. So it's a super complicated issue. It's definitely beyond, I think, my expertise. But I do say that in the conversation that we be careful not to approach it in such a binary that we automatically equate this action as completely wrong always and that one always being the right one or what have you. And most importantly, that in conversations that we have, that we center those individuals and communities that are at the heart of being oppressed and hear their perspectives on it so we can better understand the consequences of what ends up occurring. So that's probably the best way I can answer it.
All right, thank you. So another question here from Jacob Ellis. Jacob asked, I've seen a quote floating from Ben Shapiro lately saying, show me a racist law or policy and let's fight it together. How can we best engage these people, or are there laws, policies that would connect with them?
I didn't quite catch all of it. It was a slight breakup. So I heard Ben Shapiro and then part of the quote. Can you repeat it again?
Yep. So a quote from Ben Shapiro lately saying, show me a racist law or policy and let's fight it together. So how can we best engage these people, or are there laws or policies that would connect with these individuals saying this thing?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know if I mentioned this in the beginning. I think I may have alluded to it, but one thing I try to impress upon my students is that anti-racism work or policies or legislation that occurs is not the purview of one political ideology or party. And quite frankly, both major political parties have absolutely engaged at various points throughout history, some more than others at different decades or what have you, in anti-blackness, right? In white supremacist policies and you know, legislation and what have you. The way to come to the table on this has to be about policy and legislation that creates greater equity, regardless of where it comes from. So one thing I've tried to impress upon folks, and I think the question's trying to get at a political way of doing this, you know, together collectively. If one person identifies as really liberal and yet they're open to hearing a conservative argument that economically makes sense to create more equity in a certain community, then be open to it. And if it results in that, great. But if it doesn't work, then maybe trying a more liberal approach. But we don't do that, right? We put ourselves into camps and say that anything this side says or anything this side says, I have to oppose, right? And so the way you figure this out and where you stand and what policies and what legislation you support, what are the arguments being made? What are the end results of these policies being, implemented? And are they resulting in the equity that we were seeking? And if they don't still try to repeat the same thing because I want my side to win. Try a different avenue. That's probably the best way I can interpret what Shapiro's probably getting at there.
Get unmuted here. So we've got a couple more questions that have come in. Colin Jones asked us, he's our president of our Rochester chapter. One of the important things fraternities do is fundraise money. If the fraternity was looking to put some of our kind of national, or I think you could probably even say local, kind of fundraising resources and efforts toward helping progress through these issues, do you have any suggestions for organizations or causes where these donations could be best utilized?
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, it depends on what you want to do, but if you're a part of a campus community, I might recommend and suggest ways that you could use that money to create either more educational programs or scholarship opportunities for marginalized communities. One of the myths that's out there is that a huge number of scholarships goes to, a huge percentage, I should say, of scholarships goes to students of color, which is not true. 2/3 of all scholarships go to white students, and over 99% of all scholarships that are available to everyone to apply for. But there's still a disproportionate disadvantage for low-income folks from all backgrounds, or students of color, and the communities that many students of color come from, to really offer opportunities for folks to not have economics be a barrier to access to education. So I think if there was money offered to do that, it could be as simple as creating a textbook fund for folks who are low income. That might be a good cause. And if you're looking at something outside of the campus community, there are local organizations in many cities and in suburbs and even in some small towns that are fighting for a more just world that you might want to get in touch with, and whatever matches the values of your organization that you might want to support. So I would say none of those are bad ideas. Just seek the one that you can connect with. And also I would say this comes from a service learning perspective, that we're not just raising money and giving money just to do that, which helps, but also to feel good about ourselves, that maybe there's an investment of a real relationship with whoever's on the receiving end of the money, so you can actually advocate in different ways, not just financially, and you can be really invested and show a sincere investment in whatever the cause is.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks, Roger. We've got a question from Daryl Holloway, an alumnus from our Arlington chapter. He says, other than voting, how can citizens create change on a local and state level?
Show up. Let me tell you, I'm involved in school board meetings. I've done consulting and training with local schools in the county I live in. And I try to get out as much as possible. And I'd say probably 75% of the time, when it comes time to actually go to these things, I am so tired and I don't want to go. And I'm thinking I'd rather be doing this. And you want to balance your life. You don't want to be so consumed with stuff that you're not taking care of yourself. But it takes showing up. It really does. And we always, I say we always, but quite often the response by a lot of folks is that somebody's going to take care of whatever's happening. It'll be taken care of. And it often isn't. And so by showing up, it can mean just even showing up online and just getting connected with your community members, and finding out who's in the community and what the community issues are. I think just showing up that way is super important. Being uninformed or disconnected from one another as a community is absolutely important. I would say also, if you happen to be someone who is leading these efforts, so let's say you're leading a school board meeting or you're leading some kind of organization in your community, I like to take the approach that I do on my campus, and I think it's super important that we do that. And I say this to our college president and others as well. And we're at a predominantly white institution as well. When you're in that kind of a moment as a leader, it's super important to ask who's not at the table. right? It's super important to say who's not engaged in this conversation that should be here, because we know our community is diverse, but quite often the leadership that's made up of these organizations represents almost always the majority. So we have to be culturally conscious enough to always be asking who's not visible, whose voice is not present, and how can we make that more visible and present so that we can be sure that we're responding to the needs of everyone in the community. It's very easy to overlook that.
Okay, great. And I think maybe related to that, we had a comment come in from Brian Chung saying to mention that inviting people of color to have a seat at the table in these discussions among your organizations is very important.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, spot on. Yeah.
And I think, I would add on to this to Daryl. I think one of the sessions we're looking at doing in the near future, as well as maybe something around engaging in advocacy as a part of civic engagement, and kind of helping people, I think, to identify what is something that really speaks to me, what's a cause that I'm really passionate about advancing in the world, and developing actually some tools for engaging in advocacy to advance that cause within your sphere of influence.
Yeah, I love that. And I would just add one more piece to that. So for all of you who are thinking about advocacy, I love that. I'm so happy that you want to engage and do good work. So doing the work, learning how to become an advocate, and then the last component, which I think is the most important, is asking the important questions and learning specifically why you're even having to advocate for that in the first place. Why does this disparity exist? Why do suddenly I have to work in this community that needs support? How did it even get there, right? And answering those questions will help you understand the underlying systemic issues that create poverty in the first place, or create environmental issues, or create, injustice in employment or what have you. So doing the work, learning how to advocate, but then understanding the foundational issues that created the problem in the first place, that's huge and super important that you engage in.
Definitely. Thanks, Roger. Well, actually, maybe a good bridge to our next question here around educating and learning. Tyler Johnson is, I believe, a brand new graduate of our Indiana chapter, just down the road here. And he asks, as a Black member of Delta Upsilon, how do you suggest I educate or start the conversation of race with my non-Black brothers?
Whew, that's a good question. So, I, as a person who doesn't identify and is not Black, I'm going to do the best I can from a Latinx perspective. And I will say that, first and foremost, it starts with the culture and the environment that's created by the group, of being authentic and being vulnerable, and of the willingness to actually stand by and live up to the values that you espouse, even when it's difficult. So what that means is that if you have values that absolutely insist on including everybody, that you make conversations in your regular chapter meetings or periodically at events centered on how are we showing up and living out these values, and how are we not doing it, first and foremost. Secondly, I don't think it's out of bounds, especially in this moment that we're in here in our country, to start asking questions of how are we demonstrating anti-racism in how we show up as a community? How are we being anti-racist in our practices? How are we lifting up, as I mentioned earlier, when you have meetings or you have programs, how are we lifting up the voices that are in the minority or invisible in our organization? How are we allowing our Black and brown brothers to be fully visible and present, and to really be valued as equal members of our community? So I think those are important questions that you can ask. The brotherhood is rooted in extraordinarily strong bonds and values. And some of those conversations will be difficult, and it should be that way. It should be difficult because, as I explained earlier, so many of our folks that we count on as brothers or as community members have different paths and journeys that we've taken in understanding these issues. And for some, we've lived it. For others, we've never heard about these things. And then we've had everybody in between. But if we truly center our values and we cherish every individual as a member of that value set, and that we want that to be true for everybody, we have to insist upon hard conversations so that we can get to a better place. And so that I, as a Black or brown person, can feel like I absolutely am at home here, that I'm not a guest at someone else's chapter or someone else's group, that this is my home as well. And that is the first step toward creating equitable communities that you are living out day to day and that you feel every day being a part of it. And then if it ever starts drifting away from that, you can feel comfortable enough to bring it up again so that you can address it. Because it's work, it's constant work. You don't just address issues of race and then you move on. It's a constant evolution that you have to center in your conversations consistently. So I would start there. I hope that's helpful.
Great, thank you. Yeah. And let's see, I've got a couple more questions that have come in. Lots of questions coming in here. We've got one from Todd Sullivan, an alumnus who lives up in, where are you now, Todd? Philadelphia, I think. So what might be a good fraternity-wide strategy to learn our own history, acknowledge our shortcomings, and decide upon concrete actions to advance racial justice? So big question. Todd likes the big questions.
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, so you all know the DU history more than anybody, right? And maybe you don't know enough of it. So I would really maybe create a task force of folks that want to really dig in and discover the full history of DU. Also tied into the whole history of fraternity life in America and collegiate life. And to really have that understanding of how white supremacy laid the foundation for that, right? It was so exclusionary of people of color for so long. And again, frame it in a way that says, you know, we have to own that this is a structure that we inherited. You know, we didn't shape this. We didn't want this to be something that was a part of it, but it's part of what has existed, right? So maybe you do that, that kind of work to really understand fully how that structure was put into place, fully how it affected communities who were non-white, and then in doing so, start committing to what you can engage in your daily practices from today and in the future that are the opposite of that you acknowledge it. Maybe you hold a program that says we want to own our history and our complicity as an organization and keeping folks out, and we want to commit in this program or ceremony or what have you, to not only owning it, but then committing to being anti-racist and to create a better tomorrow, that we were the inheritors of a world that wasn't open to anyone, and that contradicts our values. And so identifying those things, but you have to learn that specific history first. So you might want to commission a group that really puts together a solid history of what's existed in the past, own it, acknowledge it publicly, and then commit to publicly being better, right? I think that's what we could all do.
Yeah, and actually, I think that is one of the things that's on the list here for one of our upcoming webinars that we want to add in is developing a history session so we can do a little bit more of a deep dive into the actual historical development of Delta Upsilon.
Right.
And so I think that'll be really interesting.
That's great.
Speak directly to what Todd is talking about.
Yeah, great question, Todd.
Thanks, Todd. Let's see, we got a question from Walter Oliff, alumnus from Central Florida. And Walter asks, I've seen a lot lately about fraternity sorority recruitment regarding recruitment traditions such as letters of recommendation and legacy members. And so, I don't know if you're familiar, that would be like the idea of someone has a family connection to the organization and will get like a preferential treatment in the membership selection process.
Right.
So does this propagate racism, do you think?
Well, legacies and similar types of programs were the original affirmative action, right? There's a great book called When Affirmative Action Was White, if you're ever interested in checking it out. It really talks about the history of America from its founding all the way through the 1950s. I talked about the GI Bill, for example, tonight, that you have legacy of programs or traditions that advantaged white folks, in many ways. So, in fraternity life, legacies could do that because historically so many have been white and have kept out black folks that the legacy of black folks in predominantly white fraternities is small, right? And so certainly that could be an outcome. I know it's a tradition that's extraordinarily cherished and valued. I don't know if you have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I think a strong conversation of how can we do this and honor and recognize legacy, a legacy individual, and at the same time, maybe offer other ways for folks who don't have who aren't legacies to have a more seamless path into the membership, right? So you know, it's definitely something that could exasperate, you know, the already huge advantage that so many white folks have in predominantly white fraternities. And it was the reason why Black fraternities were created, right? Because there was no other option, so we were going to create our own. But you know, it's a conversation worth having. And not being a person of involved in Greek life, I probably won't offer any more, because I don't know if I would be able to offer anything else useful on that. But I would be very, very careful to just pay attention that tradition is important, to acknowledge that, but at the same time, you know, what can we do to make sure that it's an equitable process?
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. And let's see, I think maybe one more question from me I'll throw out there.
Okay.
I think, you know, I think you kind of touched on this a little bit with Tyler's question, but I would maybe just build on that by saying we have a lot of individuals joining us tonight. I think they're in chapter leadership roles, you know, chapter officers and peer leaders, and some chapter advisors who are going to be working with groups of young men when they get back on campus here.
Right.
And so I think kind of for those individuals in kind of these leadership roles and these roles where they can kind of guide and facilitate, you know, I think they might be in situations where you're working with groups who are, you know, potentially maybe confused, maybe challenged, maybe having a lot of paradigms get challenged and questioned right now, and maybe have some difficulty processing that and experiencing maybe some things, or maybe processing emotions that they're feeling around racial injustice, around what they're seeing in the world, around what they're hearing from people in their lives. And maybe, do you just have any thoughts for those individuals on maybe some good places to start in just facilitating some conversations with their peers and just kind of opening up some of these discussions to provide space for that processing and conversation?
Yeah, I love that. I love anytime the conversation is going to happen, whether, you know, it's a formal program through a partnership with your multicultural affairs office, or through some faculty members that maybe have a strong background in this area that you reach out to and ask to help guide a conversation, or if it's at 3 a.m. in a residence hall. I think the more these conversations happen, the better. I do think it's super important, no matter where the conversations happen, that it's communicated right at the beginning that we are adhering to our principles and our values and how we treat one another. I'm not a fan of how conversations are role modeled in our society through media and the talking heads going at each other and, you know, trying to out soundbite each other, right? And so that's not learning. That's just trying to win a rating or something, you know. So I think it starts with the real intention of folks communicating. We want to have these conversations to learn more, and that's the intention, right? The intended outcome is to learn more, and then to be empowered to act in a positive way. So half the battle to that is in conversations that maybe aren't planned out so well, or are so spontaneous that no ground rules are set. Half the battle is often just getting folks to admit that there is even an issue, right? I mean, we still have a real debate in this country by a lot of folks who say that there is no systemic racism at all, right? And I really believe that people who say that are sincere, and they believe, and they probably are folks that believe that racism's a bad thing, right? But when we don't know the very basics of how systems work, and we can't even agree there, you're not going to have much of a conversation. So I think it's important to understand and get some basic education in place. So if groups want to have more of these debates or discussions or idea sessions, I think just having some good ground-based education through some of your faculty members that you can connect with would be useful. Hopefully most schools have a multicultural office that you can connect with and utilize their expertise and their services to help guide you as well. But that takes you all reaching out as well, right? And if you do this in, you know, collaboration with the cultural organizations that I mentioned earlier, it could be an Asian group or a BSU or a Hispanic, Latino, Latinx group, that's even more powerful. I think my hope is to see more and more collaboration between non-Greek groups and Greek students, to just show that, you know, this is not an issue that just is encapsulated in one arena in our campuses. It's everyone's issue. And so we have our own traditions, we have our own ways of doing things here, but this issue involves everyone and we should be involved with everyone on it. So I hope that happens more as well, and that could help guide some conversations in a positive way.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, with that, we will go ahead and wrap it up. And so I think Veronica is having a little bit of internet connectivity issues, so I'll go ahead and take us out here. But
Okay.
Roger, I want to thank you very much for sharing your time, your talent, and your research with us, and really helping us in our organizational journey as well as our personal journeys here. For the group, just want to also mention real quick that we do have 2 other webinars on the calendar right now. So next Thursday, July 9th, Hayden Ron from our staff will be leading a session called What You Can Do to Ensure the Advancement of Justice as a Focus During Recruitment. And so really talking about how you can dig into this topic and create an inclusive recruitment and membership selection process, and starting to translate some of what we're talking about into the operations and functioning of the chapter. And then on Monday, July 15th at 8 p.m., and that's at 8 p.m. on Thursday, and then Monday, July 15th, we will have a session called A Vision for a World Without Poverty. And that will be presented by Mark Burgell, an alumnus from our Northwestern chapter, who runs an organization called The Wider Circle in Washington, D.C. A phenomenal organization that really has their vision is to end poverty. And he is going to be talking about really digging into poverty, the dynamics of poverty, talking about how poverty is showing up and the issues we are experiencing in the current environment, and then also talking about the importance of civic engagement and how we can really get involved in our local communities to impact poverty in our communities. So it should be a powerful session there, and so hopefully we can see some of you all joining us on there as well. So with that, we will sign off and say
Noah,
goodnight.
do you mind if I plug something real quick?
Oh yeah, please do.
I'm just going to enter in the comments here real quick, just an email. If anybody's interested in giving me feedback on how how you received tonight's presentation tonight, I'd love to hear from you on what you learned. And then if you're interested on Facebook, my nonprofit organization is called Bridges for Justice. If you look me up on Facebook and on Instagram, love to have a follow, and you can stay up to date on some of the work that we're doing here. But I'm more than happy to reconnect with you all. Veronica always I told her the invitation is always open, and it was a pleasure to be with you guys tonight.
Wonderful. There she is.
There she is.
All right, thank you all. Everyone have a great night.
All right, we'll talk to you soon.